I hate myself for saying this, but the Boogeyman has one of the most random song placements I've seen in recent memory. It's Elvis Presley's Burning Love, which is a fantastic song, but I can't remember the last time a song in a movie felt so random, and I'm probably going to make myself sick for saying this, but 2010's A Nightmare on Elm Street remake had a much more appropriate song playing during the ending credits, and just saying that sentence is probably gonna make me puke. Stephen King is a name recognizable among horror fans. He's had a number of film adaptations over the years, just a few. Some you might be familiar with, some of them are considered true cinematic classics, but now we have 2023's The Boogeyman, which was adapted from one of his numerous short stories, and I myself am a Stephen King nut. I have read so many of his books, novellas, short stories. I've read many Stephen King titles over the years. The Boogeyman, it was originally published in a magazine called Cavalier back in the 70s, and it eventually made its way into a collection of short stories called Night Shift. And I used to own a copy of that book, but unfortunately, I think I may have sold it because I just had too many books laying around, and yeah, times were tough, so, you know, needed some extra cash. But anyway, The Boogeyman, it was a pretty average Stephen King short story. It's one of those short stories that you read where you're like, yeah, you know, this is pretty decent. Let's move on. It was effective. Let's move on to the next short story and see if that one's, you know, a bit more unique and creative. So now we have this feature film adaptation directed by Rob Savage. Now, I want to take a moment to talk about this guy because he is a huge inspiration for me, because I actually read an article about him in the most recent issue of Fangoria, I believe, and this is a guy who struggled for years to make it into the business. You know, he had made a number of short horror films, you know, at the beginning, you know, of his filmmaking tenure, and, you know, he tried numerous times to get involved with a major studio, but he got turned down constantly. And then a little event happened called the coronavirus pandemic, and he saw that as his chance to make something, you know, truly relevant. So he released a film called Host, you know, which actually took place during the COVID-19 pandemic, and it was a pretty well-received film. And you could tell that Rob Savage is a very passionate horror filmmaker. He put everything he had into that film. He literally got a bunch of actors together, and he, you know, directed them, you know, over FaceTime essentially, you know, over Zoom meetings, and the actors had to do all their own stunts. They had to do like all their own makeup, and Host was honestly a very impressive, you know, film. You know, especially for a director who wasn't very well known at the time. He went on to make Dashcam, which I personally couldn't stand. It had one of the most irritating lead characters in recent memory. But Hollywood noticed. They realized that Rob Savage is a very talented guy, so they wanted to give him a shot at making a feature-length film. Apparently he had a number of scripts thrown his way, and he decided to adapt a story written by, I believe, his favorite author, which of course is Stephen King. So, The Boogeyman, as you can tell by the title of my video, it's pretty average. And overall, I wasn't the biggest fan of this movie, but we'll get into that. But the general plot of this movie, you have this distressed father, played by Chris Messina, whose wife has recently passed from a car accident. You have his two daughters, one played by the enormously talented Sophie Thatcher, which you can also check her out on the show Yellow Jackets. I really recommend checking that out. That show is utterly fantastic. And you have this young girl played by Vivian Lyra Blair, who you might recognize as Princess Leia Organa in the Obi-Wan Kenobi series. So you have some talented actors here. And basically these characters are dealing with the death of this loved one, and they're all dealing with it in, you know, their own ways. The father is pretty much pushing all of his emotions to the side, and he doesn't want to deal, you know, with the fact that his wife is now dead. The teenage daughter doesn't want to forget her mother, and is still very, very sad and depressed about it. She's getting bullied at school. Typical Stephen King bullies show up here. The youngest daughter, she's dealing with it in her own way. You know, she's still a bit lively and, you know, fun-loving. But, you know, this family, you know, they've gone through some terrible, terrible things in their lives. So Now, they have this evil supernatural entity called the Boogeyman, which essentially kills kids when their parents aren't looking, and it likes to play with its food. Kind of like another Stephen King antagonist, Pennywise the Clown. Pennywise is another villain that liked to, play with its food. It liked to scare its victims before consuming them. And actually, I wonder if Pennywise the Clown and the Boogeyman are somehow related. Maybe they're distant cousins. You never know. I'd like to see that family reunion. Pennywise talking to the Boogeyman. So, how many kids did you kill this year? Quite a few. How many did you kill this year? Well, let me tell you. It was pretty easy, especially in a place like Derry, Maine, which sucks. So, let's get into some of the positives about this movie. It is a very, very well-crafted film. You can tell Rob Savage really was trying with this movie, and there are a number of creative shots in this film. You saw one in the trailer where the little girl is looking under her bed and the camera just flips completely upside down. Some creative shots here and there. This is a director with a vision, and I'm very excited to see what he does next. The acting is stellar, particularly by Sophie Thatcher. I've said it many, many times, I need characters in horror movies that I can root for, and I really do root for her character. She's this teenage girl who's dealing with a lot. She has to be a good role model for her younger sister. She's trying to convince her dad to actually open up and talk about his feelings. And yeah, I felt sorry for these characters. And there are even some decent set pieces. There's one that takes place inside a therapist's office where she, turns off all the lights, and then she, turns on this singular red light, which constantly flickers, and it's a really tense moment, and you see something creeping up in the ceiling that's just getting closer and closer and closer, and that was a pretty decent set piece. There's actually a very good jump scare involving a video game, of all things. That actually kind of made me jerk in my seat a little bit. So there are some things to appreciate about this movie, but it's an incredibly standard horror film. I mean, honestly, it has a lot of familiar elements, and it kind of felt like it was written by an AI program. We've seen this sort of story done multiple times throughout the decades. You have this monster that can be passed, along to different victims. You have characters who are dealing with a tragedy in their lives. You have, this character who has dealt with the monster before and has turned, pretty insane. Just all these things. It's like listening to a really generic love song. I mean, it might be a really nice sounding love song, but is it really saying anything new here? It just sounds like every other love song we've heard before. I mean, obviously the artist is talented, but there's nothing really new being said here. Oh, and then one more good thing about this movie, the opening scene is genuinely intense. Why is it that children often get killed in the opening scenes of Stephen King features? Yeah, that kind of has me concerned a little bit.
You're both having these manifestations. What is this supposed to be? It's the thing that comes for your kids when you're not paying attention.
Also, Stephen King fans, you will notice a number of familiar tropes in this movie. There are some very, very contrived school bullies in this film, and they're Stephen King bullies, man. Now, we've seen them many times throughout the decades. There are these teenage girls who are picking on the main character relentlessly at times. I mean, showing absolutely no sympathy for her situation, and they don't feel like real people. They feel like genuine monsters. I mean, you can't tell me that characters in this sort of situation wouldn't feel at least a little bit of sympathy for someone who has lost a family member. I mean, some of the teenage girls in this movie, my god, they're monsters. What can I say? They're genuinely terrible, just terrible people. But yeah, I mean, we've seen these sort of bullies in Stephen King stories before, and oh my god, okay. So all these horror climaxes feel the same now. I mentioned it in my review of this year's Megan. I'm just getting so tired of climaxes that take place inside houses. Just all the houses in horror movies look the same, just typical, middle-class houses. At least in Megan, they threw in one creative element, with the robot fighting Megan at the end. This just takes place in an average, American residence, and god, I know they probably did that because it was cheap to make, and the creature design of this movie, okay. I was reading beforehand about how the creature in this movie has a very creative design, that the creature itself is, striking to look at, and I was anticipating something really fantastic, something that Guillermo del Toro would have whipped up, but this looks like something Guillermo del Toro would have, puked out of his mouth, because you'll find more interesting creature designs in a typical Resident Evil video game. I mean, this monster looks... the titular villain of this movie looks like every other monster we see these days. There's nothing creative about it. It was very disappointing. And Rob Savage, he actually created a pretty neat-looking monster at the end of Host. When we finally see a reveal of the monster, it was pretty freaky looking. So, yeah, not very creative at all, again, the slightest. I was very disappointed by the creature design in this movie.
Okay, for my 307th book, this couple is attacked by a lamp monster. Ooh.
The ending is open-ended, and it does, make way for potential sequels in the future, but people aren't going to remember this movie. I mean, there was a film back in 2005 called Boogeyman, and for what I can remember, that film had more creative elements in it than this. This was very average, forgettable Stephen King fare. I'm glad that Rob Savage got this opportunity. I can't wait to see what he does next. I think he is a very talented filmmaker. And yeah, I just hope he gets to do something more unique, more creative, because this just felt like it was made at an assembly factory. Another standard horror film, the long line of, just average, by-the-numbers horror flicks. So those are my overall thoughts on the Boogeyman, guys. I heard that it was originally supposed to be released directly to streaming on Hulu, I believe, but audience reactions were so positive that the studio decided to put it in theaters instead. I don't mean to sound like a grumpy Gus, but I don't know why they made that decision. Oh, which, by the way, okay, I didn't even bring up the Deus Ex Machina ending of this film. Okay, so I'm not talking about, the final moments of this film. I'm talking about the way they eventually defeat the monster. It kind of betrays one of the main themes of the movie, which is, you should, confront, your trauma and deal with it. You can't ignore it forever. So at the end of this film, mild spoilers, I guess, a supernatural force helps them defeat the monster, and I felt like it was such a cop-out, man. I felt like it betrayed the movie's themes, and I did not like it at all. I thought it was incredibly corny and ridiculous, and yeah, even the way they destroy the creature wasn't very creative. Anyway, guys, those are my overall thoughts on the Boogeyman. Definitely not one of the better Stephen King adaptations. It's definitely better than 2022's Firestarter. Honestly, I'd rather be set on fire than sit through that flaming pile again. But guys, go see the Boogeyman and make up your own mind. It does have some decent things in it. It just, I've seen hundreds of horror films, so and some of them are starting to feel the same, so I just didn't get much out of this movie. But again, go check it out, make up your own mind. I would love to hear your guys' thoughts as well. Thank you so much for joining me in my discussion of The Boogeyman, based on a short story written by the king of horror, Stephen King. Guys, 2023 is halfway over, and we got some good stuff, coming up. We have Five Nights at Freddy's, The Exorcist Believer. We got some cool things coming out in the later half of this year. I'm very excited to check out all of those. I wanted to talk about this movie because I just couldn't stop thinking about it, and I just had to get my thoughts out. But thanks again, guys. If you liked what you saw here, please subscribe to my channel, Round the Clock Frights, for more horrific content. And let's boogie, man. Let's boogie. I love my bad jokes way too much. Anyway, guys, take care, stay scary, and have a safe day. Boogie, boogie, ooh, boogie, boogie.